Welcome to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. I am John Gulliver, and I will introduce the seminar series and our speaker. The seminar series is co-sponsored by the Water Resources Center and the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, both of the University of Minnesota. Our speaker today will be Dr. Alan Davis. Alan is a professor and the Charles A. Irish Chair of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Maryland. Alan's interests are in aquatic and interfacial environmental chemistry and physiochemical treatment processes. And his primary interest for many years has been on urban stormwater quality. This includes characterization of stormwater quality and development of new treatment technologies. He has extensively examined bioretention for water quality improvement and has also studied water quality improvement in other stormwater BMPs such as swales and wetlands. He has also developed media for targeted removal of specific pollutants, and I believe he'll be talking about that today, bioretention treatment media. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Alan Davis.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you, John and Andy and everyone for having me here at the University of Minnesota. And thank you for making the weather at least tolerable for me today. I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the research that we've done over a number of years, kind of putting together what I call this phosphorus story, learning some various things along the way. There's a list of students here that have contributed various parts of this work, and there may be others that aren't on the list or so forth. It's still an ongoing and evolving story, and I'd like to share some of that story with you today. I kind of start with a little bit of perspective, and it's my understanding we're up here where the top red star is up in here. Why? I guess St. Paul, these are the capitals here. I'm from down in here, and it's important to get a little bit context, and this context drives the outcomes and the goals of our research. So we're in the watershed of the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay is one of the largest estuaries in the world. Within the Chesapeake Bay, it is considered as a 303D impaired water body for hypoxia. As a result, the Chesapeake Bay has, I think, the largest TMDL anywhere that's based on sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So while this Chesapeake Bay is a huge water body, a huge asset to the local region, I think it's important when you look at it that the Chesapeake Bay itself is actually dwarfed by the watershed. The watershed covers 6 states in the District of Columbia. And when you look at the perspective like this, I think you get the idea that while Chesapeake Bay and water quality is a concern, it's really what's happening on the watershed is driving the characteristics of the Chesapeake Bay. So I want to talk a little bit about stormwater. I know everybody here, I know has some stormwater background, but again, to put some things into perspective, these are kind of input, output measurements that we've done with some of our stormwater control measures. So on the input side, this is kind of the water that we see, especially off asphalt areas. It can be black, it can be dark because of the asphalt attrition and so forth. So that's the water quality that we're dealing with when we talk about our urban stormwater. And these are some numbers from the National Stormwater Quality Database and the International BMP Database, kind of some geo-mean values on what the characteristics of urban stormwater happen to be. These are some traditional characteristics, nutrients, metals, some bacteria numbers, and so forth. So getting, again, an idea from a chemical and a biological perspective on urban stormwater. And then as we start delving deeper into this is some work that was just published over the past year, a broader look at organic compounds, and then even some work on microplastics, these emerging contaminants. So we're seeing, I guess, basically, if we look for it, we can usually find it in these urban stormwaters. So a whole list of various types of organic compounds, some of these pharmaceuticals, and urban pesticides and so forth that we see also in our urban stormwater. So this represents the challenge that we have within these systems. And, where are these coming from? And again, lots and lots of different sources. The automobiles, our urban areas, our infrastructure, lots of nutrient sources. Many of these nutrients may have natural sources, but we're conduiting these nutrients into an impervious area so that we have a direct path into our streams and so forth. And in some cases, they are anthropogenic. And this is an old picture. And I don't know how well you can see the orange sidewalk up there, but we have a homeowner who has fertilized his sidewalk in this particular case, and we know where that's going. So also as part of this, that we're dealing with very dynamic systems, that our stormwater shows us a first flush. So the first flush, the first flow off of our watershed, in most cases is always the dirtiest. This is a data set that we gathered, and these are nitrogen data, but you can see this with many other data sets where that very first couple of flushes are much more contaminated, and then we seem to reach a more steady state as we go along. So the characteristics, the chemical characteristics, and also visually, you can see a difference in the characteristics of our stormwater. So if you're a beer drinker, you can kind of think of it looking like this, going from our first flush to our cleaner. If you're a wine drinker, you can look at it this way. But what it does look like is this. These are the actual samples that match up with the data up above. And you see that first sample being like the original pictures that I've shown, quite dark, and then they clean up as we go further along in the rain event. So in response to the stormwater challenge, we have this, this concept of low impact development or green infrastructure, or whatever name you want to use, and all of these various technologies, green roofs and water harvesting, impermeable pavers, and so forth, that have really come into their own over the last decade or so. So many of these technologies use some type of media. And, John kind of challenged me to talk a little bit about media. So, to start with, why do we need media in these particular systems? What's the purpose of the media? And I came up with 5 here, and there's probably some more. We do want to slow our flows down from a hydrologic perspective. That's quite important to us. We want to remove pollutants, and physically and chemically, and there are biological aspects to that as well. Many of these are vegetated systems, so supporting the plant growth. Microbial populations we're finding more and more important. And there's, to a certain extent, some type of structural support in having the media at least support itself so that it doesn't collapse upon itself and cause us drainage problems and so forth. We may want some other type of structural support as well. So broadly looking at these from a media perspective. And again, putting this into the perspective of stormwater management, what do we want from stormwater management? Not a lot. We want these systems to be small and easy to work with and clean and so forth. So, and this is the list that I threw together quickly. You could probably add some more to this as well. So we're asking a lot from these supposedly simple technologies. Delving into the media a little bit, we can have sand and gravel. A lot of this is related to maybe some structural characteristics or some filtration characteristics. Talk a little bit about that. They're not going to hold a lot of water. The sand gravel itself are not going to have a lot of chemical or biological activity, although some of the biomass may grow later on. We can discuss, and we'll discuss a little bit about inorganic, mineral type media, and then organic media. And as well, there's been a lot of interest in waste products, using waste products, and we've done some of that, and some others around have used waste products as well. My focus here, and it's my focus because that's where we've done most of our work, is within the concept of bioretention or rain gardens, a media-based system, very porous media to promote infiltration, generally on the order of about 3 to 8% of the drainage area, a couple of feet deep, vegetated systems. And I say vegetation to survive, and in many cases that is the limiting factor, what will live in these relatively harsh environments that we call our urban stormwater infrastructure. So I like to collect pictures of bioretention. So whenever I go someplace, I'll try to look for the bioretention. My wife understands that now. She gets it. So if we're walking along and I say, I got to go take a picture over there, she says, okay, go take a picture. I'll be here waiting for you. And we're good with that. So you see bioretention all over the place. When we talk about bioretention media, generally characteristically, it's going to have some amount of sand, some amount of topsoil, and an organic matter source. Different jurisdictions are going to have different recipes for your bioretention media. In Maryland, we've settled on this basically as a recipe. It's tended to work fairly well for us. The 50% construction sand, 30% topsoil, and our organic component is a triple shredded hardwood mulch, and these numbers by volume, so by weight, they're going to be different than that. So this is what we've been working with recently. Previous to this, locally, there was a lot of different recipes, and that becomes important as you talk about pollutant removal, and especially talking about phosphorus removal. So talking a little bit about the inorganic media components, sand is important, and especially from a filtration perspective, having sand there and filtering is important. Silts and clays have some chemical activity. Iron oxides and aluminum oxides, which we'll talk about, have some phosphorus uptake capabilities, zeolites, and other materials. And there's others also that have been investigated for removal of specific pollutants from our stormwater system. So this is kind of the media universe that we're looking at. On the organic side, there's been a lot of interest in compost for better, for worse. The focus there, compost, metals removal, and some other issues, mulches, interest in wood chips to promote denitrification in bioretention systems. From a broader perspective, looking at activated carbon, which has capacities for removal of a number of compounds. And then the explosion in biochar over the last couple of years, which I think everybody says biochar can solve all of our problems for us. I'm not convinced that's the case. For one, because biochar is different everywhere you get it. And actually on the East Coast, we have trouble sourcing it. It's just not as available in our area. So that's all I'm going to talk about biochar. But biochar, it's very easy to find somebody talking about biochar in the stormwater field. So my overall thesis here is these green stormwater infrastructure technologies perform following fundamental rules of engineering and science. We just need to understand these rules. That doesn't mean they're simple systems. These are very complex, dynamic, changing systems. So what I want to talk about this in the context of phosphorus as an example, but many of the things that I'm going to talk about can be extended to other urban pollutants as well. So looking at our bioretention system and looking at treatment mechanisms as an environmental engineer, that's what I'm focused on, is specific treatment mechanisms. We can have sedimentation and filtration processes in the surface areas of systems. And it doesn't all have to be bioretention. You can take these mechanisms to other stormwater control measures as well. Once you get down into the media, you can have adsorption processes, biological treatment processes. We do have the vegetations there. There's a lot of unknowns about what the vegetation can do for us and can't do for us, and what ultimately we should do with the vegetation and so forth. So now that we have these stormwater control measures, we can focus on the right-hand side. We know what comes in on the left, and now these are the types of samples that we're getting as outputs from our bioretention systems. The outputs that I'm going to talk about are primarily from underdrained systems. The standard design in the state of Maryland is to underdrain your system. So when I talk about outputs or whatever, then these are underdrained systems. And these are the outputs that we've gotten from two different facilities. I'll show you the data related to these. The one on the right, very clear. The one on the left having a brown tinge to it. So a lot of data, the field data I'll show is from our University of Maryland site, was installed in 2006. It looks a lot different now, and I'll show you some photos how it is evolved. But we've done probably about a dozen research studies on this particular site over the years, and have one ongoing right now where we're gathering some data. So to start with, this was the first study on the site, was published in 2009. And these were looking at total phosphorus concentrations. And I just kind of made these box and whisker type plots showing, in this case, the phosphorus inputs. And this is the College Park site I showed you. And another site about 10 miles away. It's in a different county. At the time, the bioretention mixes were different, so the design's a little bit different. Showing a mean and I believe 75 percentiles, ranges, and so forth within my plots, and also a log scale for my concentrations. So of interest here, one is I got more phosphorus out than going in this particular site. Whereas the other site, I got some removal. So some different designs put in basically the same time within a few months of each other. Why was I getting more phosphorus out than coming in? And that kind of starts the story of where we were looking at phosphorus, now pushing 15 years ago. And to start, we need to delve into the stormwater itself, what's going on within these systems. And if we look at total phosphorus concentrations, and this is an average, again, from the databases, this is about 0.25 milligrams per liter total phosphorus. And realizing that the phosphorus, and true with many other pollutants, is partitioned into two parts, the particulate phase and the dissolved phase, about 50-50 each. And then on the dissolved phase, about 2/3 of that being inorganic phosphate and maybe overall 16% organic phosphorus. So breaking this up again into its components, and that's important as an environmental engineer to understand the specific unit processes that are going to be removing these specific pollutants. So focusing on the particulate side and then also focusing on the dissolved side. Particulate pollutants affiliated with the particulate matter, and for the most part, we can look at the fate as correlating with what happens with the particulate matter, the suspended solids. So processes such as sedimentation and filtration within our stormwater control measures. Well, first we can take a look at filtration theory. Filtration theory developed with drinking water sand filters, developed over a number of decades. We've been filtering drinking water now for more than 100 years. This is steady state filtration theory, but it still gives us an idea of what we can think about and predict within these stormwater systems. And plugging in some typical values for bioretention, media, and stormwater, filtration theory predicts that bioretention systems should do a fabulous job with particulate matter, that we should be getting 100% removals down to the micron-sized particles. So theory says we should get great removal of suspended solids. Here's the TSS data from that same site during the same study. So again, kind of box and whisker plots, log scale. And in both cases, inputs much higher than the outputs. We're getting reductions well over an order of magnitude, well over 90% removal of suspended solids. And we found this with study after study. I think everyone that I talked to in this study, bioretention, says that they do a great job with suspended solids. They're great filters. So no surprise there, and it matches what the theory tells us as well. So great removals. And, again, we look at this, and really it's almost independent of the media. You can put a very sandy media in, you can put a very fine media in, you're still going to get very good removal of suspended solids and anything particulate related, oil droplets, microorganisms to a certain extent. The capture is part of the story. With microorganisms, what happens after the capture is another story, and that's not a story for today. They also capture big particles. We've all seen that. And if you go out to these systems, they're always full of bottles and so forth. They'll capture anything and won't let it go through. So they capture suspended solids. So we followed this up with a later study and actually were able to differentiate between the particulate phosphorus and the dissolved. So same site, different study, and this looking at the particulate fraction. And in this case, the particulate phosphorus removal is very good because the suspended solids removal is very good, which says that our target has to be on the dissolved phase. really what's happening is with the dissolved phosphorus phase. So shifting to the dissolved phase, then we're really talking about something independent. It's a different treatment mechanism. We have filtration and removal for the particulate side. Now we're talking about the dissolved fraction. Oops. Thought I had something else there. So what we're looking at there is now talking about adsorption. Adsorption onto some specialized media to help us to remove the dissolved phosphorus fraction. So starting to look at what we might consider as an ideal media for use in a stormwater system. And these are some of the different parameters that are important to us. And again, you could add more to this list, especially if you're dealing with vegetation, and you can certainly add more to this. But as we start talking about media and media analysis and development, these are really the prime parameters that that we look at. Along the way, we need to be careful with phosphorus release from media. Organic matter can leach phosphorus during composition. So I want to talk a minute about leaching and start there with a friend of mine, compost. It's been a lot of interest in compost use in all types of stormwater control measures over the years. There's a push from a number of organizations to use compost as broadly as possible. We did a study on compost. We looked at biosolids compost. We looked at some other types of compost. And a lot of the data I'm going to show you were in these, what I call large column systems. They're actually about almost 4 feet deep. So depth-wise, they will align with our field systems. They're almost a foot in diameter. So these large column systems. And we did a lot of studies with different types of compost. And the compost is going to leach nitrogen and phosphorus. Biosolids was over the roof with concentrations of phosphorus and nitrogen. Some of the other types of compost weren't so bad. Visually, we can even see that. We were only putting in dissolved phosphorus. So our input looked like this, and what we were getting as output was from here. So anytime you're dealing with compost in these stormwater control measures, you have to be aware of the leaching of nitrogen and phosphorus. And when we go back to my original cell, why we were leaching as phosphorus is we did have some leaf compost in that original system that we put in 15 years ago. We have an ongoing project where we're looking at compost blanket because somebody was interested in a compost filter strip blanket. And just looking at the data, this is what the water looks like coming out of our compost filter strip blanket. Draw your own conclusions about that. I have one slide here on salt and sodium chloride. We did a set of those column studies where we would load this with kind of our traditional stormwater for 5 storms in a row, and then we hit it with a high salt concentration, which kind of shows where these bit darker lines are where we hit it with salt. So a baseline at 20 milligrams per liter and then a high salt at 2,000 or 5,000 milligrams per liter. And when we hit it with these high salt concentrations, we got a couple of things. We got a big spike of turbidity, which flushed through these systems, and then we got a spike of phosphorus. We spent some time trying to figure out what's going on. The turbidity looks like it's related to suspended solids washout due to some colloid destabilization. The phosphorus is unclear. We had some trouble trying to speciate it because many of the samples were just so turbid we couldn't get good phosphorus measurements out of this. So it's something that at this point is somewhat preliminary, but we saw these phosphorus spikes as well as other spikes every so often after we added these intermittent salt concentrations. Is it an ion exchange event? I don't know. That's, again, one of the things that we started to look at a little bit. And actually, here's some photos of the very turbid water we got out of this system. And it cleaned up later on, and then we hit it, and it would go turbid again. So that's kind of looking at the leaching side. On the treatment side, dissolved pollutants we're interested in removal by adsorption. And looking into the chemistry of phosphorus, and this has been developed through the agricultural literature for decades, is that Soils that are high in amorphous aluminum and iron concentrations have a high affinity for phosphorus. So we borrowed on that and said, hey, let's look at aluminum or iron materials as amendments for phosphorus removal. So we specifically looked at aluminum-based water treatment residual. It's a waste material that you can find from many drinking water treatment plants. Drinking water treatment plants, not wastewater treatment plants, drinking water treatment plants will use a material such as alum to help to remove turbidity from the water, and it becomes a wastewater waste material to them. It's mostly an aluminum hydroxide material. So we started looking at this material for enhanced phosphorus removal. So we started with some simple studies, worked our way up to these larger column studies. This was one of these large column studies that we did a number of years ago. We input our phosphorus over about a 6-month study. The total input was 111 milligrams of phosphorus. We had 2 columns side by side. One was our original bioretention material at that time, which contained a little bit of leaf compost. And then the exact same material, which contained 5% of my water treatment residual. The output from the traditional was 190, more than what we put in. The output from the one that was amended was 15. So a huge difference in the phosphorus removals, or in this case, actually the leaching of phosphorus between these 2 columns. So that was very promising to us. So we said, can we try this out in the field? So we went out to our College Park bioretention cell and said, let's try this. How much do we need? We did the calculations, and we need about 15 tons of wet water treatment residual that we could incorporate within the top layer. So kind of a retrofit situation. So we called up the water treatment plant, said, can we get 15 tons? I said, sure. How much is it going to cost me? $100. Sign me up. So we went to our College Park site. That's what it looked like at that time. Stripped off all of the vegetation except the river birch. We left the river birch, which actually do quite well in these facilities. There's 15 tons of water treatment residual. This was in April. It's probably been close to 10 years ago now. I remember the day because they dumped it right before a big event on campus. And the facilities people kind of went ballistic on us. So we had to scramble, get some shovels and everyone. We spread it out. It was rotated in. It was replanted. And within a few months, you couldn't tell anything was done to it. So we were able to go back in and monitor and gather some new data. On the left side was the original data that I showed you to start with, where we were leaching phosphorus. On the right side was this new data set. In this case, we actually saw phosphorus reduction. Our phosphorus removal improved. We'd like to attribute that to the water treatment residual. We don't have a side-by-side study, but we were able to get a reduced phosphorus output from an input in this particular case in a field study retrofit situation. We've looked at phosphorus accumulations within the media. This is actually the Silver Springs cell that I showed some data from earlier. This site was completely redeveloped, so the whole cell's gone. Before it was gone, we went in and kind of dug things up, looked at the vegetation, but also went in and looked at the media. We looked at it during a rainstorm, and it had some pockets where water sat longer than others. It had settled in some places, and looked at the accumulation of phosphorus within the media. And it's within the upper layers, as we would expect. Within the top 10 centimeters, so what's that, 4 inches is where you're seeing most of the phosphorus. And then once you get down below 6 inches or so, it's pretty much background concentrations. This site was in the ground for, I think, around 10 years before we went in and dug it up again. So you can see the accumulation where you would expect it to occur, where the water is sitting the longest and at the surface of the media. So I like to talk about the concept of phosphorus removal in these systems. This is what I call the P-star model. And that we have phosphorus coming in at a whole range of concentrations. And as it works its way through the media, you're getting maybe phosphorus taken out, maybe it's being put in by what's happening in the media, and ultimately you're getting out a P star. And that P star is relatively constant compared to what goes in. You may have a wide range coming in, you have a much narrower range coming out in most cases because it's being controlled by the characteristics of the media. If we have oxides and clays like aluminum oxides or iron oxides, I know John and Andy and the Minnesota group has done a lot of work with iron. And in many cases, there are many parallels between what we've done with aluminum and what they're doing with iron for the uptake of phosphorus. So if we can increase these iron and aluminum oxides, we can drive this P star pretty low. The opposite side, the organic matter is important to these systems, but we need to be careful about our organic matter. If we have organic matter, like a high nutrient compost or something, we can leach and we can put out more phosphorus than what we're coming in, and our P star can be quite large. So somewhere along the line, we need to keep a balance between these two so that we can get our phosphorus concentration down where we want it to be. And right now, I'm not a big proponent of the use of compost. I think there can be better alternatives than compost. And I am a big proponent of these oxides, that if we want to go in and get some high capacity, long-term removal of phosphorus, we should look at enhancing the aluminum and iron oxides in these systems. So kind of the last part of my talk, looking at some work we've done with advancing some of these specialized media. The chemistry there supports the strong adsorption of phosphorus onto aluminum and iron oxides. It's fairly well-developed chemistries. So we spent some time looking at some of these other parameters, looking at organic phosphorus in addition to inorganic phosphorus, trying to look at high flow media. There's a lot of interest in what locally they call a high flow media, where we can push our footprint smaller and smaller. Implementation is important. We have to have something that a contractor can get in the ground. We can't have this fancy material that we can't get in the ground. So we've done some work with a couple of organic phosphorus compounds in addition to phosphate. We've prepared a high flow media, which is really nothing more than a coarse sand mixture. But this matches some of the specifications of high flow media that have gone in some stormwater control measures locally. And then trying to develop a simple implementation, kind of a one-pot mixture that maybe a contractor could put together. So in addition to the water treatment residual, but looking at alum directly as a chemical addition, and also a partially hydrolyzed alumina as a chemical addition. And I've got a little bit of data here, and I don't want to go into a lot of detail. And actually, most of this was small column data. We haven't scaled it up yet. But the more aluminum that we added, and by adding the water treatment residual and the alum and the polyhydrolyzed aluminum, we were able to continue to increase the capacity of our media for the uptake of phosphorus, not only inorganic phosphorus, but the organic phosphorus species as well. And again, some data sets here kind of showing the same thing, looking at what is known as the oxalate ratio. It's a ratio of extractable aluminum and iron divided by the phosphorus. So basically with my x-axis showing the amount of aluminum and iron in the system compared to the uptake of phosphorus at a specific phosphorus concentration, and the different colors being the different types of phosphorus species. So really, the more aluminum and iron that we have in the system, the greater the capacity for our phosphorus uptake. So kind of bringing this to conclusion, particulate affiliated phosphorus is readily filtered in our bioretention systems and our media systems, and there's not a lot of critical design to go along with that. It's pretty straightforward. Once you get to the dissolved side, media selection is critical. Compost can leach phosphorus, and other organic materials can leach phosphorus. Media with high amorphous and aluminum content can absorb phosphorus, and that's where we need to be looking, if absorbing phosphorus is our goal. We've looked at water treatment residual, alum, and a partially hydrolyzed alumina, modified the media, and this does exhibit our high adsorption capacity. Overall, we can reduce our load significantly if we can combine our treatment with the volume reduction that happens within bioretention systems. And then again, my salt spikes may be releasing captured P. Still a lot of work to do on that. And then I think it's another slide too. Sometimes I get asked to look in the future. It's always dangerous to try to predict the future. Within our area, again, the Chesapeake Bay sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus, we have a TMDL for that. It's there. It's supposed to be reached in the next decade. Are we going to do it? Jury's still out. I'm not sure about that. It's also a challenge when you're dealing with 7 different jurisdictions, 6 states, and the District of Columbia, several states which have no economic benefit from the Chesapeake Bay at all, but still being a major part of the watershed. Locally, within a couple of streams, and I know this has come up with some of my discussions the last day or two, locally they're starting to enforce bacteria TMDLs for some of the local streams, and the municipalities dealing with that. And actually we have a couple of water bodies where they're enforcing PCB TMDLs. So that's kind of where we are at this point. Looking at the future, if we go into our 303D, 305B list of impairments in the state, we can find a number of other different pollutants there that are causing us impairments. And this one, and this one. So if you want to look in the future, maybe this is where our future is if we're going to start addressing the impairments that we have now within our existing water bodies. To what this leads me to think about as a researcher doing what I'm doing is, can we customize these stormwater control measures? Selecting specific media, whatever this media may be. If we have a phosphorus problem, let's get a phosphorus media in here. And a wide open areas of vegetation side. What can we do on the vegetation side to try to enhance the performance of these systems? Are there customized vegetation or vegetation rotations that we can add to this system? Other types of media, other types of vegetation, layerings of media, which complicate things certainly from a construction and specification perspective. But if we have multiple pollutants, maybe we need to look at a layered system. And then, engineering controls like internal water storage to help us deal with the nitrogen side. So there's lots of opportunities and lots of research opportunities. That's where, I see kind of my future and the future of the field going. We do have 2 ongoing studies looking at some of these materials that I just talked about. At the bottom is a water treatment residual sand, kind of a plunge pool system that we're actively monitoring. And then a fairly new project, just been in the ground a couple of months, where we were able to get a contractor to put in the partially hydrolyzed alumina over top of the media. And that's an ongoing project. Really have just a few data points for all of these, but that's where we continue to go. And they can be constructed. It's a bigger challenge, but we can put them in the ground, and we're going to see what they look like. And I'll leave you with my last slide. This is actually I guess the slide's a little bit old now, but at the time, a brand new house, $750,000 house, not too far from my home. And there's your bioretention cell sitting right in the front yard. This is at the end of the cul-de-sac. So if you're a green person, there's an opportunity to have your own rain garden right in your front yard to address your stormwater, but also the stormwater of the entire cul-de-sac. So with that, I'd be glad to try to answer some questions and go from there.
Thank you. So that was very interesting questions that you might have for Dr. Davis. Okay.
Great information. Thank you. Did you in your media where you looked at aluminum, did you see any point at which the aluminum was maybe having negative impacts on vegetation or hydraulic properties? And then also, did you look at the road salt effects in any of those media?
First question, I think the second question, no, we have not looked at any road salts. What I've shown you is the limit of our road salt work at this time. So I don't have anything more really than what's there. We've looked for negative impacts of the water treatment residual and the other aluminum materials. So far, we haven't found them. We have seen no problems with hydraulic conductivity. The College Park site that we retrofit, the retrofit was done almost 10 years ago. It's still functioning very well. We've continued to monitor for aluminum. The aluminum concentrations are all below, I want to say, make sure I say this, a 1 part per billion, below 1 microgram per liter. The pH stays neutral, so we're not worried about aluminum leaching. There certainly could be problems out there. We have not found them yet.
Yeah, that was one of my concerns. I was concerned about toxicity on that. But as an agronomist, I was questioning if you have done any selection for vegetation that would take up more phosphorus, you know, or something that would produce more forage so that you could take that off on a residual basis.
Right. We have not, and I'm not an agronomist, and I'm going to, my very rough back of the envelope calculations is that it's very difficult to get reasonable phosphorus uptakes within the vegetation, that the amount of phosphorus is just too small within the vegetation. The nitrogen you can have an impact on, but the phosphorus you can't. A bit of an aside, we did play around with some metals hyperaccumulators. They lasted about 2 weeks before they keeled over dead within the system. It's just too dry in the summer for them to survive. That said, there's clearly opportunities to do things on the vegetation side.
Okay, we have one question from online.
Thank you. Is there any specific requirements that the spent water treatment alum has to meet to be able to be incorporated into the media? And do you have any means of estimating how long the water treatment residual or other additives will continue to absorb phosphorus?
First question, it's something we haven't looked at. It's something that I would like to look at. Obviously, the water treatment residuals are not the same from plant to plant, site to site, that there probably should be some specifications developed. We have not gone down that line, so I don't have that information. There have been other studies where research groups have looked at water treatment residuals from different sites, and they are quite different. But as far as speccing them for use in stormwater, I don't have those. Lifetimes, these are all, again, somewhat back of the envelope calculations, but we can push lifetimes depending on the amount of aluminum that we put in there, you know, into the 20 or 30 year time range before predicted breakthrough would occur. There's a lot of assumptions that go into that related to focusing on the dissolved phase as opposed to focusing on the total phosphorus and so forth. But those are the types of numbers that we've been getting. Obviously, we don't have any studies that are 20 or 30 years long. These are based on extrapolations from lab studies and those large column studies that we worked on, and penetration depths when we've gone on and destructively evaluated the columns when we were done with them.
Thank you. So you're doing what looks like fascinating work in one of the areas of the country with the most active and sophisticated stormwater management in the country. Can you talk a bit about the methods to get the lessons and research results that you're generating out to local practitioners, and what's worked and what hasn't, and how it could be done better?
How much time do you have? Yeah, I mean, that's always a challenge. And to a certain extent, I'm going to punt on that. You know, I'm a researcher, and that's my primary focus. That said, I'd love to see these get out into the field. but I can't spend all of my time trying to get them out into the field. I will work with the sponsors, with the local agencies and so forth to make that happen. The state of Maryland does have, and I don't know the exact name, but they do have a program for new and innovative technology. You bring in the results, basically kind of a tape tarp set of field results, and they can approve an innovative technology. So that's kind of the regulatory aspect of it. I work as close as I can with our state agencies, with our local counties to do what we can to get these in the ground. In some ways, implementation and enforcement of the TMDL has hurt us, because right now, every construction dollar has to be focused on meeting these TMDL requirements. And sometimes going on the innovative side doesn't quite pan out when you're trying to make the balances work. Kind of a short answer, and maybe offline we could talk about it even a little bit more.
Another question from online.
Thank you. For the filter medias where you have compost included, what duration of time would you anticipate there to be sustained phosphorus export? And if you don't include the compost, what media can you use to ensure the plants have enough nutrients and growing media to support the plant life?
Always two questions. Let me do the second one. I might ask you to come back to the first one. And there's actually a slide here that I took out that, if necessary, I can go back to. The important aspect on the vegetation side is the initial establishment of the vegetation. And if you want to use a little bit of compost focused around the vegetation to get it started, I can understand that. We have to get the vegetation established. You don't want to load it into your bioretention cell. That said, on a continuous basis, if you look at the loads of phosphorus coming in, not the concentrations, but the actual loads, that if you're taking a large area and focusing, a 20-to-1 or a 10-to-1 ratio, the amount of phosphorus coming in there is actually quite high. And based on my knowledge as an engineer, not an agronomist, that there's plenty of phosphorus in there to support almost any type of vegetation growth as necessary. And I think anyone who's looked around and seen these facilities, they tend to be lush and green. Maybe not with what you want them to be lush and green with, but they're lush and green. So I don't think that phosphorus limitation is an issue. Can you repeat the first question, please?
Certainly. For these medias where you do have a compost additive and you've shown that there is a export of phosphorus exceeding the influent, what duration of time would you anticipate that elevated export to occur for?
Right. To a certain extent, I have to punt on that question. I can't anticipate because I have not seen it happen. We've run studies that are over a year in duration. That's about all I can do in a laboratory type study. And they reach a steady state, but they've never fallen off. We've never gotten, to the best of my knowledge, we've never gotten phosphorus removal from any of the systems that we've put in compost alone. Certainly none of the biosolids compost, not even any of the green waste compost that we have done. We actually did a couple studies where we amended compost and the water treatment residual together, and we were able to get removals. But over a 1 year plus duration, we have not gotten them down to phosphorus removal. Would it happen 2 years, 5 years down the road? I really don't know.
One more question here.
I was glad to see your slide about the speciation of phosphorus. We've heard some ramblings about the need for more research about the speciation of phosphorus from runoff. In your opinion, or through data in the National BMB database, in your opinion about, do you think more work is needed on the speciation of phosphorus in runoff? Is it the same from Maryland to Minnesota? Is it geographically different from north to south, east to west? Or do you think runoff is very specific to an individual catchment area in terms of speciation?
You had me go until that last statement. I think on a broad overall picture, it's not that different. The data that I showed in the beginning is based on, actually it's based on some work that we're in the process of trying to compile into a research publication where we've gathered as much data as we could from the BMP database and the National Stormwater Quality Database. And the numbers there are fairly consistent. So looking at it basically nationwide, it's mostly US data. Obviously there are pockets that are in the databases and so forth, that it seems to be relatively consistent from place to place. That said, if you go to an individual catchment, it could be different. You know, if you're dealing with a residential area that has high maintenance lawns, it could be different. So from a broad perspective, I think the answer is yes, it's pretty consistent. But to say that this broad is specific to a specific catchment, you could be looking for trouble.
Okay, I have one more. We have one more question, and I'll take that. You found that aluminum oxide removed dissolved organic phosphorus, which was very interesting to me because we always assumed that dissolved organic phosphorus would just go through the system and not be absorbed by anything. What do you think would happen with iron oxide? Do you think there's a similarity there?
Right. Again, kind of two questions. Yes, I think there's a similarity. Based on everything I've found, what we see with aluminum, for the most part, should translate to iron. That mechanistically, the uptake of phosphorus is very similar between the two minerals. That said, we looked at two specific organic phosphorus compounds. You know, and maybe this kind of goes back to John's question on speciation. We know that there's organic phosphorus, but we really don't know the speciation of those organic phosphorus compounds. We picked two which we assumed are present in these stormwater systems because they're two common organic phosphorus compounds found in soils, the phytic acid and the other. And those were both removed readily by our materials. We don't have any true proof saying that these are the dominant organic phosphorus compounds in our urban stormwater. I don't think that work's been done.
All right, so let's thank Alan for his very interesting seminar.
Thank you.
Welcome back to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. We are now going to move into our panel discussion with Alan and our three local panelists. My name is Andy Erickson. I will work as a moderator for the panel. I will start by introducing our panelists, give them a couple minutes to describe their relation to the topic that we have today, and then we will move into our question period. So to start, I'm going to start on the far side, your left, my right. We have Bryan Pynn from the Washington Conservation District. He is a watershed restoration specialist. So Bryan, what's your relation to this topic of bioretention and enhanced media?
Right. So at the Washington Conservation District, we work with 8 watershed districts within the county. So we have a lot of partners who are interested in, you know, treating water quality to meet their goals. And we have implemented numerous iron enhanced sand filtration systems. And we also had dabble in experimenting with water treatment residuals, wastewater treatment residuals. That one, there's a little hang up on that one, but I think for the most part, we've had very good luck with the iron enhanced, and we've worked with different configurations in the cells themselves to promote plant growth while, you know, not leaching phosphorus. And so we've worked with the different compost or, you know, dare I say, peat amendments that have actually, they're very low on the phosphorus side. And so we're hoping that long-term those are panning out, but so far so good.
Great, thank you, Bryan. Our next panelist is Patrick Martin, who's a water resources specialist at the city of Richfield. So what is your relation to this topic?
So in the city of Richfield, we're kind of landlocked, sort of. We've got an offline alum treatment system for one of our lakes and watersheds effectively that runs alum through discharge water before it goes through to the rest of the watershed district. That also provides capacity for the watershed and removes phosphorus. So it's kind of what we got going. Let's see where we take it.
Great, thanks, Patrick. Our next panelist is Curt Coudron. He is a project management supervisor with the Dakota County Soil and Water Conservation District. Curt, what is your relation to this topic?
Well, similar to Bryan and Patrick, I'm on the kind of implementer side of it, or the practitioner. So we work with landowners, watershed management organizations, cities, looking at different BMPs that can go in, looking at different, what are the pollutant concerns, what are we trying to do, what tools do we have available. And so having the enhanced filters or having the iron enhanced sand filters is another tool that we've used in combination with some of our other practices. So it's another tool in the toolbox. We've done about roughly a dozen iron enhanced sand filters throughout the county over the last 7 or 8 years. So got a few of those, and we've seen a few different results, different ways that it's been used.
Great, thanks, Curt. We just had Alan's 35-minute relation to the topic, which was great to kind of set the stage for our discussion. What I'd like to do with the panel is open to your questions. So what questions do you have, either for Alan or for the rest of our panelists? Please.
One of the concerns that I've got is that a lot of our water quality targets, TMDLs, for example, are written to achieve total phosphorus reductions. And historically, we focused a lot on particulate phosphorus. And it seems like we've been driving people, a lot of stormwater management in that direction to take out the particulate fraction, when we know the dissolved fraction is the most bioavailable form, and we're missing the boat on that. I'm just curious at the local level, your perspective on that, what you're trying to do to maybe overcome that. I know you're putting in a lot of practices. Is that something that you're concerned with also?
I think I can start with that. I think we've thought long and hard about, just based on the research coming out of here and with respect to Alan as well, how the older practices that were put in, say, 10, 15, 20 years ago, a lot of those were very compost heavy with under drains. And as this research started coming out, we've started to try to figure out a way to phase out those existing systems or retrofit those existing systems to where we can actually pull out the dissolved phosphorus instead and replace a lot of that compost media with something different. And so far only media replacement strategy has been working with some sort of peat amendment and then adding, to limit the compost additions, and then adding iron to that media. Right now we're just at the beginning of that retrofit process though. And I think this is something that's going to be, easily the next 10, 15 years as we start, we want to keep those old practices functioning. And, it's about the time too, where some of these could use an overhaul, where you're about the end of the lives of those. So I think it's, again, we're cognizant of it, and we're working hard at trying to retrofit for the new wave of research that's coming out on this.
I guess since our TAF system is really our main sort of thing, and I don't want to say only, but the one we're focused on most, we're kind of in a position, or a good position, where we can get in front of some of these future issues before they're bigger issues, I guess, for us. So we're kind of trying to evaluate what either fits best situationally for some of our lakes, ponds, and that kind of thing, and what we can do instead of what we can fix, I guess.
Yeah, I guess kind of thinking back on some of the practices we put in and going back to like the very first bioretention project that I worked on. I just remember going through the installation process. It was a sand and compost mixture, had everything in. I was really excited about seeing how this project would work. First time it rained, run out there, see what's coming out of the under drain. And of course, looks just like the photos, it's got kind of that brownish tinge to it. And so really kind of made me question, are we doing the right thing, and where are we going with that? And so that's evolved a little bit over time into using different mixes. So looking at, instead of using compost, we've tried coir pith on some of our projects. We've tried layering with different types of media. So using the organic component on the top, and then switching to more of a sand, and then using an iron enhanced sand on the bottom at an under drain. So trying to incorporate some of those practices that will deal with that dissolved phosphorus component.
Yeah, I guess just a couple things to add to that. One is, going back to some of these early compost issues, as a researcher and someone very interested in technology, I think it's important to me that we show that to get to the root of the problem, and that dealing with stormwater with LID or green infrastructure is not a bad thing. We just made a couple of choices that weren't the best, so that it doesn't get out there and say, hey, these things don't work. We're going to shift away from them and do something else. So getting to the core of the problem, I think, is very important. The other part, going back to the question a little bit on the dissolve side, is as a researcher, certainly I'm interested in what's happening now, but I'm also trying to set the stage for where we may be 5 years from now, 10 years from now. So some of what I've shown today and some of what we're looking at may not be directly applicable now, but somewhere down the road as things change, and maybe we're looking at pushing phosphorus concentrations lower and lower, that we have some type of background information on various media that we're not starting from scratch.
That's great. Now, what I'd like to do is I want to dig in a little bit to that and maybe answer or kind of expand on one of the previous questions. I'm actually curious for our local experts, have you measured this soluble particulate fraction in your watersheds or in some of these spaces where you're putting in bioretention? Are you seeing a wide range of variability, or does it seem to be pretty consistent for what we've seen locally? I don't know if any of you have measured that, but if you have, I'm interested.
Not directly measuring it. I'm basing a lot of this off of a lot of the consulting firms that are working with the watersheds on some of these larger projects. I know Browns Creek in particular, that watershed has a really interesting configuration where they're actually, pulling water, for lack of better ways, out of Browns Creek, running it through an iron enhanced sand filter and back out, and they're monitoring the influent and the effluent. And, they seem to be getting pretty good results out of that after the few years that it's been in, and the dissolved portion in particular. I think there are issues over time for, not to go down the maintenance road here, but, there are issues over time with the maintenance and the vegetation buildup and the, what do you want to say, pond scum buildup, things like that. And as well as E. coli that you have to be, aware of. But I think in general, we, from the little that we have monitored, we are seeing promising results. Yeah.
Yeah. And,
Go ahead.
I guess on our end, we haven't done a whole lot of monitoring. That's been one of the things that we've wanted to do. So we've really been focused on getting the projects in. There's typically support and funding for doing the projects initially, but getting that follow-up of monitoring how well is it working, what's longevity, when do we have to do maintenance with it, that's always been a challenge. And I think that's something that as we keep going down this road, we need that information to make sure that we're making the right decisions and that we're putting in the appropriate practices.
Yeah, I think, I don't know a ton about the specifics, but we're getting some pretty good removals out of when we're pulling from surface water that's coming in, because we have option of pulling surface or deep. But I think I want to say 90% removal of total phosphorus from that surface amount that's coming in. So I think that's encouraging for us, but I think evaluating further what's going on in the lake is going to be big for us, but I'm not sure where to go from there.
What other questions do you have for our panelists, including our audience online? Yeah, let's take an online audience question.
So we have one question about lime as a other water treatment residual that has some capacity for phosphorus removal. They're wondering, why do we hear so much about aluminum and iron and not so much about lime and calcium forms?
It's probably fair to say in Minnesota, we probably have very few calcium-based treatment systems that we have any data on. We've done some research here at the University of Minnesota on calcium-based. It's a different process. Iron and aluminum is absorption-based. Calcium is precipitation-based, so it's a different chemical process. We've done some research. It can remove phosphorus, but the issue is what happens to that precipitate, right? Where does that build up? Can that wash out before it's actually captured is an issue, and it's not as stable as is absorption reaction resultants, right? Products. So it can change based on pH and things. I don't know if any of the other panelists have other additions to that.
No, I think just in the limited work that we did with, we're looking, we had a project down in the southern end of the county at Carpenter Nature Center where we were looking to pull about 14, 15 acres of agricultural runoff that dumped into a ravine. And we were kind of looking to do this hybrid urban ag practice, where, we get some pre-treatment up top. It goes through first base, and that's, primarily just sand and peat. And then that would have gone through what would have been a wastewater residual treatment media. And ultimately what it's a really quick contact time. It would have been great to use from our initial scoping that we had done with the engineer consultant. But at the end of the day, I think, PCA hadn't, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency hadn't made a determination on, the proper way of using this yet. And so from my understanding, though, that we're actually in the process of working on that and incorporating that into the storm manual. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I think you said it very well, that the chemistries of the iron and aluminum are fairly similar with sorption processes, whereas with the lime it is a precipitation issue. I have not looked at it to any significant extent. Also within a humid climate, I think you'd probably consider here to be a humid climate, that it is, the phosphorus control is generally through sorption. If you go to a more arid climate, then the use of lime may be a more practical solution. I don't know. I haven't worked in a situation like that.
And I'm happy to share the work that we've done on that previously. If the online person that asked the question will contact me, I can share that. What other questions do we have? Do we have other online questions? Please.
We have one question about what advantage do you see in applying an amendment in bulk to the filtration media versus as a discrete layer?
Well, I'll maybe start with that. The advantage of putting it in bulk is just probably ease of installation. It's a lot more simple process to have one material and have that installed. If you're putting it in layers, then, working with the contractors, making sure that it's installed properly at the right ratios is another challenge. And so it just makes the project more complex. In the end, we've done some projects like that where we have layered. It's been a challenging installation process. We worked through it, but it's not as straightforward as just saying, this is what we want. Here's the cubic yards and install it.
We had one installation at a school in Stillwater where it was a large filtration basin, or actually infiltration. It was an infiltration basin that we converted to a filtration basin, and we had toyed with the idea of stratifying the layers of iron on top or iron on the bottom. And ultimately what we did was we put iron in two kind of discrete cells along the side. It didn't act like a bench, like on a wet pond. It just more acted like the under drains were within the iron cells themselves. And then the water ended up eventually making it to the under drain in that cell as the last way out. And so then we could then control where the iron was, if we needed to pull it out, or if we needed to, cap it off, what have you, if something went wrong. We had that as a fail safe, but it seemed like long-term, it's been working really well, just from a functionality standpoint. I think it's, it's nice to have that in its own kind of area that you can pull it out later if you need to. So.
I guess depending on the material, you just have to be aware of hydraulic conductivity issues. If you're setting it up as a specific layer, you have to ensure the hydraulic conductivity. If you're mixing it in bulk, then you'd have a little bit more flexibility on working with the hydraulic conductivity.
That's a very good point. Any other additions or comments to that question? Do we have other questions from the local audience here? Great.
I guess this is more a comment than a question, but I'd be kind of interested in your thoughts on it. I guess I'm concerned about the speed that this information is getting out about the leaching of phosphorus. I would say at this point, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands of these practices implemented in the state. And, I'm still seeing individuals using that 70-30 mix, and I don't feel like the stormwater manual has been fully updated to address this. They still have many mixes in there that would leach phosphorus, even though they kind of have a disclaimer on it. So I'm just curious of folks' thoughts on how we can get this out there quicker. I know this issue's been around for probably at least 5 years now. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, echoing my comment before, how we've recognized that this is an issue that we need to address, and that we're trying to figure out a way in which to phase out some of the older basins and retrofit them. I think kind of lost my train of thought here. I think in general, sorry, I totally did lose my train of thought on that. Yeah. I think the phosphorus leaching in general, though. I don't know. I guess I just echo that earlier comment, and that we're trying to recognize that we're that is an issue. I think the available mixes in the storm manual. I don't know what product other than compost or peat right now are available options, and so we have deferred to peat as much as we absolutely hate going to peat for all other sorts of environmental issues. We found that peat has been successful, and we've been going as lean as a 20% mix by volume, and even using that only in the top foot of our layer.
I was going to say on the peat, that's what we used to do in the sports fields. We'd always use 20% at the top of peat, and that only give you like 2% organic matter, but that was enough to sustain what you were trying to do.
I think I guess to translate this to the lake sort of concept is where we become sort of a phosphorus source is when we disturb the bottom. So kind of avoiding either drawing in from that or discharging to the bottom for us is where we're trying to avoid becoming a phosphorus source for downstream and the rest of the watershed. But I guess I don't know quite how else to tackle the question or comment.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a concern, and some of that is beginning to be addressed with some of the layering and only adding the organics that are needed, or the compost or peat that's up on that upper layer to support vegetation. But I also think that getting the Minnesota Stormwater Manual updated with more information, getting research like this into the practitioner's hands so that more practices get installed, I think that helps to build that support and kind of transition over as we are retrofitting some of the projects that have kind of hit the end of their initial lifespan. That's a good opportunity to switch over as well and go away from that the sand compost historical mixture.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, just to follow up on that. I think being that we are left with compost as our only option, that and peat, it would be nice to see some agency sponsor like a really comprehensive study though on like how lean you can actually make these mixes without getting any sort of leachate. And I don't know. I mean, like you guys, right?
Maybe I will plug. Actually, we're currently doing a project with the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council, funded by them, looking at bioretention media, biofiltration media specifically, looking at compost, looking at peat, looking at different types of compost and some of those ratios. We are proposing to expand that work to see how lean can you go and still get all of those benefits from that organic material. So that is something we're trying to do here locally for Minnesota. And I think that's probably been one of the challenges, that there haven't been a lot of studies for local sources of compost in Minnesota. What can you use? What can you use consistently and get results that either don't leach, or how can you avoid the ones that do leach phosphorus? So we are working on that.
Well, one of the things with peat is you are fully or almost fully decayed, where the other materials you're not decayed, and so it takes a lot less, and it's going to have a lot less life, because as soon as you get vegetation going there, you're going to have organic matter. That's all you need.
So I have a related question. I was fascinated by Maryland's mix, 50% sand, as I remember, 20% hardwood mulch, and 30% topsoil, which to me doesn't sound like it's definitive. Could you comment on that? For example, I don't see much organic material for the plants. Hardwood mulch has organic material, but it's not necessarily available to the plants.
Right. It works. I mean, we found it works. Again, the critical part is to get the plants established. Once they're established, then you do have the stormwater load that's coming in. And again, you run those load numbers, it's significant, the amount of phosphorus coming in, because you're focusing it into a focused area. And then once they're established, as mentioned, they're going to build their own organic matter, and that's all you need. So once you get the system established, it seems to work for us.
Even though you don't seem to have readily available organic matter for the plants.
It seems to work.
Other comments on that discussion a little bit? Other questions? We got a question right here.
So I have a question about the salt events that you spoke about during your presentation. Sorry, but I'm going to drag you back to it anyway. Salt, road salt in particular, is a serious stormwater concern here in Minnesota. Are you essentially trying to look at the question of whether road salt hitting bioretention is mobilizing phosphorus? And then it sounds like you have preliminary results, but not final stuff. Do the preliminary results indicate that this is maybe a significant issue?
Simple answer is yes to all of the above. There's still a lot of questions. Again, we're limited by time in many cases. What happens over a long term? We've run these for about a year, and we still see impacts over about a year. It's not a field study, it's a lab study in these large columns that are looking at. I'm not hitting it with true stormwater. We're hitting it with 5,000 milligrams per liter, which is representative, but you're not going to see constant concentrations followed by low concentrations. So you can shoot holes all in the type of research that we're doing. But based on what we've seen, we see fairly significant impacts over the time frame that we looked at.
What do you think the possible lessons are in that work?
So yeah, what are the lessons from that?
Maybe the lesson is that if we may not be getting what we think we're getting if we don't include impacts of salt. I think that's my lesson at this point. And I'm not sure I can take it much beyond that at this point, because we're assuming that we're getting X pounds of removal over an entire year, but if we're not including some of these salt impacts, we may not be getting that much removal.
And I can kind of support some of that work. We actually did some work a few years ago looking at salt impacts on compost that releases metals. So it's a very similar type result when you're talking about dissolved metals that are captured by compost. Compost is very good for capturing metals, but salt then can mobilize them and release them in the effluent. So we have to be very careful about what we're doing with these things. What other questions?
So I heard stormwater manual mentioned a couple times and my ears perked up. So I'm curious, to get something in the manual, it needs to be properly vetted. So we have to be careful about that. So how do we get the information out? What are they doing in the Chesapeake Bay? Do they have approved mixes, or is it kind of, how do we go about that? How do we get information out that hasn't been thoroughly vetted?
Maybe the question is also to our practitioners, what would you want to see in terms of what is vetted, right? We wouldn't want something to just go in the manual just because. We want it to be vetted. We want it to be reliable so that we can make good decisions based on that. So maybe that's a question, the other half of that question. What would you like to see for that vetting process? Things like that.
More ability to field test to prove how all this works. I mean, I feel like, you can do bench tests all day long, but, as we've seen, things become quite different in the field. And I'd like to see a lot more of that. I mean, we have a lot of practices that are equipped to handle the monitoring equipment. We have staff that can handle the work. It's just a matter of, just having the funding and the time to be able to do it. I mean, it always comes down to money. I know that, but I look at these things every day and I'm like, wow, it'd be really nice to be able to just grab a sample out of that and see what's happening right now, and we can't.
I think I would agree with everything you just said, where time and resources to actually test and see what's going on in different practices would be great help.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit of kind of that catch-22 of, to get it into the stormwater manual, it needs to be vetted. But if we're going to be putting these projects in, we also need something that we can rely back onto for design standards and kind of as a baseline. And so it is a tough situation. But I think we do have enough practices in that have various, different types of media that are that are set up for monitoring. You know, we've got a couple of side-by-side studies with different media using kind of traditional mixture, using a iron hand sand mixture, using a coir pith with just an organic compost top layer for vegetation. And those are set up where we could install monitoring equipment and see what the influent and effluent is. But you know, just like has been said here, it's a lot of time and money to do that. And as practitioners, we don't necessarily have the budget to do the monitoring. You know, we're really geared and set up for putting the projects into the ground. So if there is an ability to kind of connect that, you know, the sites are available. There are BMPs out there that we can monitor. It's just a matter of getting the data from them.
Go ahead, please.
No, I agree. And, you know, outdated stormwater manuals are a problem everywhere. They do need to be updated, and it's hard. It's costly to do that. There is a vetting process and so forth. These are kind of at the far end of, I guess, the scientific realm. That there's the research side, which is trying to do new and novel things, but that stormwater management manual has to have proven technologies, because that's what everyone's relying on. So I guess my statement there is things are changing quickly, especially in the stormwater field. There's a lot of research going on in a lot of places. So whatever it takes to try to keep them as up to date as possible. On the compost side, there's been a lot of research that's been published, both small scale and field data on demonstrating some of the impacts of compost. So it's really a matter of trying to stay on top of things as much as possible. And I know that the stormwater manual people have as much challenges with time and funding as everybody else does.
I think it's probably fair to say the Minnesota Stormwater Manual, if not the most updated, is probably the most frequently updated. Mike might say it was updated as recently as yesterday, right? He'll do it right now, right, exactly. But maybe just to ask again, what about bringing other technologies from other parts of the country that are demonstrated there in field tests or monitoring? How comfortable are we in pulling that to Minnesota and assuming that it'll work here just as well as it works other places? I don't know if that's part of the hesitation from some of our local practitioners, but maybe you can speak to that.
I mean, I think we've been looking at, you know, national examples for all of these things that we've been implementing, you know, within the last 10 years. It's whether or not it's been entirely endorsed by the storm manual or not, you know, as long as we felt comfortable with it being vetted as a practice. You know, I think we do run the risk though of, you know, it's something not being climate adjusted, you know, and I think it's a very important that if it is to be a recommended practice in the storm manual, I mean, everyone's going to take it as gospel at that point. You know, you know, and so I think if it is going to be integrating, it does have to be adjusted for our specific situation. Yeah.
Any other comments on that? So we have a comment or a question here in the back, and then we'll go to an online question.
This is just a follow-up to that discussion. For me, I would like to see those mixes in the manual that do leach phosphorus removed. I can think of very few instances where we would actually want to install a feature like that that leaches phosphorus in the state of Minnesota.
A question online?
So it's sounding like a lot of the issues with phosphorus leaching might be unique to the underdrain systems. Could we see any advantages in not having an underdrain and relying solely on infiltration, or would that lead to other complications?
I think that's what we've been considering as an option. You know, that's like the most drastic option, you know, especially with in light of these, you know, road salt research that's coming out. I just, you know, if you're left with just infiltration though, you're left with how much of the state are able to actually implement smaller practices. You're not left with a lot of options once you rely just on infiltration, because the soils are just terrible in most places and great in just a few. So I mean, unless we can come up with some other sort of like filter mechanism that inserts into the underdrain, but now we're like overcomplicating what should be a beautifully simple system, you know? Yeah, right.
Yeah, I think that just it kind of goes back to how much water can we treat, you know, in a particular practice. And most of the practices that we're setting up are they're relying first on infiltration if we can. It may be a combination of infiltration and filtration depending on, what we need to actually treat. One of the things that we've done is we've set up those under drains with a valve. So essentially, if we can get good infiltration, we don't need to rely on that under drain. We can shut it down. If we have kind of marginal infiltration, we can throttle that up or down a little bit to maximize the amount of water that's infiltrating and minimize what's just being filtered and discharged. So we have been trying to address it. We don't have a cure-all, but that's a fairly simple addition that we can put onto the practices.
I think to echo Kurt's comment, that's been our now standard detail is, if we are doing under drains, they have to have a gate valve of some sort. So we can control that, and we're constantly out there, as long as we have an inspection program to go out there and check those out, it's important.
I think to add our perspective, at least in Richfield, we are extremely limited in areas that we actually can infiltrate just based on our wellhead protection area. So just another consideration to add in.
Yeah, there's multiple reasons why you might not be able to completely infiltrate, right? So that kind of also supports then, if we have to have under drains, a treatment train approach, right? Maybe it does need more than one practice to be able to get all of these different pollutants. Other questions from our audience, both online and in person? Please.
Does anyone on the panel have experience with some sort of organic fiber that might have less degradable nutrient content, but still have the metal absorbing capacity?
So maybe other than peat, is there other kind of organic material?
Yeah, Kurt had done some core fiber,
Yep.
right?
So we've tried some coir pith, so real small coir fibers, incorporating that in at about 20%. Seems to support vegetation. Just been able to do visual assessments of it. We don't have any monitoring data in terms of performance of it, but that seems to be functional. Plants side by side with a compost mixture are pretty much identical.
I know that is a challenge looking at some of these alternative fibers. Do we have availability, like Alan mentioned in his presentation? There's not all of these products are always available in certain markets, and Minnesota is a long way to ship stuff to.
Early in your presentation, you made reference to zeolite. What was the reason for bringing that in? Was it absorption, or was it moisture, or what?
We did some studies with zeolite just for nitrogen, for ammonium, trying to look at what we can do to reduce ammonium concentrations as low as possible. Again, it's not a nitrogen talk, but from the nitrogen side, we have to deal with ammonia, we have to deal with the organic nitrogen and the nitrates. So at that point, you're really looking at almost a treatment train approach from the nitrogen perspective.
So I have another question, actually. I want to move to this big topic. We've talked about implementation and some design ideas. I want to talk about maintenance. What have we learned about maintenance for these filters? Because this is it's added maintenance to have this enhanced media, right? I don't know if we have some stories from the field, or if Alan has some references or knowledge from his experience or others that he's read about maintenance of these types of filters.
At this point, I don't have a big maintenance story. Let me defer to the others, and maybe I can add on. They're more the maintenance experts.
Well, I guess one of the things that we've come up with in our design process is actually thinking about that maintenance and what's needed ahead. So making sure that you've got proper access to each site, which is pretty standard for any practice, but even more so on these where you're going to have to go back in and change media at some point. Looking at so at your under drain, making sure there aren't tailwater conditions or something that's going to obstruct that flow, making sure that you've got good aeration through the system, especially when working with iron, so you don't end up with anoxic conditions. If at all possible, setting up in a location where you've got power, so if you want to do monitoring in the future, you've got power to do that, or any other need. And then I guess another big thing is just keeping the filter clear. We've had issues with some of those plugging up, like pond filter benches. We've used iron filters alongside of those. And if you have duckweed or any sort of plant material in the pond, it tends to seal over really quickly. And that can really reduce the amount of water going through. Yeah, I don't know if there's any others.
I think at least with Taft Lake, we found when pulling from the deep intake that we are able to get a lot of phosphorus out, but kind of at what cost, where we're having to do maintenance more frequently and doing the acid wash of our filters, which definitely would take a toll on like equipment and all that, shortening the lifespan, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. So taking into account, is it worth it to pull it deep to get a good number, I guess, versus getting the shallow and getting consistent results without having to deal with long-term maintenance issues and that.
Yeah, I think we've got a few approaches. One of them is, me and my colleagues are always looking at what everybody else's practices are doing and learning from them, so you can, a lot of other people are, learning the hard way, and then we're just trying not to replicate that down the road. But I think one instance in particular is, we were really sweet on the filter benches immediately in concept on wet ponds, and, looking at all the problems people were having with those, we decided, just like until we find a steady state for those, we're just going to stay away from those and just integrate them into our, our filtration and infiltration systems, kind of our dry beds, and I think also I know a lot of people early on would take the iron filings to the site, mix them with everything on site, and that ended up, introducing lots of foreign material to that, or that there wasn't a homogeneous mixture, and so a lot of the iron would bind together in big clumps. And so we only our spec is just purely pre-mixed from one vendor, unless you can show somebody else who has proven test results on their mixtures. I think also it just maintenance in general. Having a maintenance apparatus. We at Conservation District. I can thank Mike Eisenstein here for setting that up. But we've taken it over after he's left us, and it's having a maintenance crew in house to actually handle a lot of the maintenance issues. So we can actually respond to a lot of these things quicker than you'd normally be able to if just letting things fester until you find somebody to be able to go on site and handle the issue.
I guess one of the things I can imagine is a challenge with maintenance of enhanced media is it's hard to see the problems, right? Visual inspection you can do for vegetation, the surface sediments, and kind of those more common techniques. But if you want to try to maintain or inspect this enhanced media, because it's below ground, that makes it a challenge, right? So there's some questions or comments here.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that too. Another place where we've made a lot of progress, I think in Minnesota at the local level, is on our level of pretreatment. And the mousetrap basically that we're kind of adopting now is this concept of shallow and dry pretreatment devices in a lot of our smaller scale practices in urban areas. So shallow, so it can be easily accessed, and then dry because it's much easier to take out dry accumulated gross solids and sediments than it is kind of that wet soupy stuff. And we've been applying that in a lot of different areas. Although the one challenge that we still have, which is an interesting one, is that we're in our rural areas, we're still having big challenges with gravel roads and these filtration practices. And so part of the urban water quality practice approach has kind of transitioned to paving first, and in order to allow better treatment of that stormwater. So that's an interesting outcome of this filtration technology. Is paving better or worse? When we talk about crushed limestone roads, there's just no way to treat that level of turbidity in the water.
Paved to have less maintenance, right?
All right, I'm going to try to fit in with the locals and ask two questions. So if we were to try to start using aluminum residuals in our bioretention mixes, what kind of testing should we be doing on that so that we can get consistency or that we understand what the differences might be? And then also the second part, when we're looking, you're talking about maintenance, a lot of these we're not going to underdrain. We have a lot of good soils in Minneapolis. And so if I'm not underdraining, how can I test? I can't test influent and effluent. So how do I test? Is there a way to test the soil, the media that we can figure out that we need to replace it?
Again, working backwards, I think if you're not going to underdrain, I'm not sure necessarily the need for the enhanced media. That if we don't have an underdrain system, that the phosphorus should take care of itself along the travel path somewhere along the line. As far as the specs, I think there's some basic specs related to aluminum content, and depending on what you're looking for, maybe particle size or hydraulic conductivity or something along those lines. It's something that we haven't followed through completely as far as laying down specifications for different types of materials from different places.
Hydraulic conductivity more than moisture content or some other parameters.
Right. No, probably all of the above. Again, trying to, I'd have to sit down and think a little bit about what type of differences we may expect from site to site, plant to plant. But yeah, I think probably pH and moisture content would also be part of a set of specifications.
Other questions from our audience? Do we have online questions? People putting those in?
Just one quick comment on the sand. I mean, sand's not always sand. If it's a 270 screen versus a 160 screen, quite a difference in the hydraulic conductivity and the percolation through that. So that would be one that I would say that should be in a specification that we don't normally do, but the sports fields and the golf course people have for years. So it should be one that should be incorporated in there. And USDA uses a different 270 screen and above as sand, where the sports people always say a 200 and above. So just comment.
I guess, when you start talking about specifications, and certainly it fits in with the field that you kind of have two ends to look at this. Certainly, the tighter the specifications you can put down, then I think the more reliable type of results you're going to get, the more confident that you're going to get what you expect to get. But you start doing very tight specifications and all of a sudden your costs can go up, then certain materials are going to be excluded and so forth. So you really need to begin to balance these two. And that's something we're dealing with in Maryland, not only for stormwater media, but just general topsoil media use throughout various types of state projects. That right now, and again, kind of getting in a bit of a tangent, but a lot of the topsoil is not just true topsoil, it's manufactured topsoil by various landscapers that are mixing this, and this, and it meets topsoil specifications. And I think you're going to run into that as well in some of these media specifications. How tight do you really want them? The tighter you get them, then you can probably become much more confident that you're going to get a certain result out of your discharge pipe.
Yeah, I think to echo that, like this is what's happened when we've started to spec this 2080 blend of peat, where we want a certain type of peat. It can't be sphagnum. It has to be, a kind of a reed sedge mix, and it has to have so much, it has to be below a certain phosphorus threshold, upon like a Bray test or something like that. And so we have one true provider that we recommend in our spec and say, prove it to us otherwise that you have something that can meet this spec. Otherwise they have to send in their other pre-blended mix and have all the tests done. But this other provider has done all that for us and routinely updates their testing to keep showing that their media is good. But this is very true though. You run low on suppliers at some point with the tighter your spec is. Yeah.
I guess another question I have is maybe bigger picture. If we're thinking about trying to do more enhanced media bioretention in Minnesota, and we already have a number of these, right? If we just talk about iron enhanced, a recent database showed that we have 150 or more individual iron enhanced sand filter basins in Minnesota, which is a big number, right? But if we're going to look at things like spent lime or biochar or water treatment residuals or other things, I guess where are the big barriers right now? What do we need to overcome to move forward in this area? Is it simply getting details in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual? Is it more that we need to get the information locally to put into the Stormwater Manual? What would you recommend that we work as a group to kind of move this whole emphasis forward?
Yeah, I don't know. I think once you see something in the Stormwater Manual or MnDOT spec, it ends up, all the suppliers end up finding a way to carry it to meet spec. And I think that's, and so then I just think at that point, we're reliant on MnDOT and the Storm Manual people to, have those proper channels for vetting that. And I think it, you know, again, I think this whole salt thing terrifies me. And so I think it's just having some answer to that, rather than just shrugging your shoulders. But I think that's just been, it's like, what can you do? You know, it's like, we're all fighting the same fight on that. So.
Yeah,
Go for it.
I think, you know, getting it into, you know, MnDOT and the stormwater manuals, that's important. I think also having the field-based research, you know, we're seeing an increasing kind of push to have these measurable results ahead of time, you know, knowing exactly what this project is going to do before anyone invests in it, or before they commit to funding a project. And so the more of those hard numbers we can get, that's actually field-based, kind of outside of that controlled laboratory environment, and we can then take those numbers and say, you know, we've got good evidence of what is working. We're confident that this is what we can get out of it, instead of saying, you know, we think this is what we're going to get out of it, because that can kill a project immediately.
Yeah, no, I think there's kind of a hierarchy of all of this. There's some basic research that needs to be done with some of these materials. You talk about biochar. There's still a lot to be learned about biochar. Once we start getting some of the fundamental understandings, then the idea of specifications, which we've talked about, what will work and what doesn't, working your way up to field studies, and then ultimately getting into the manual. So there is a process that has to take place, and I think all of us fit into some part of this process to make it happen.
And you know, I kind of see a chicken and the egg, right? We can't get into the manual until we have hard data, but we can't build it until we have hard data. So what comes first, right? But I think in Minnesota, I think arguably we have a lot of cities, watershed districts, soil and water conservation districts, other entities that are willing to take a chance on some of these things, right? We do some laboratory research, maybe we even do pilot scale, and we've had a lot willing to put the money in to try it somewhere to get that field scale data. And I feel like in Minnesota, at least, that's been really, really helpful for us to advance some of these topics. So being conscious of time, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to close with our last question. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer. The idea is, you know, we've demonstrated kind of the phosphorus capturing ability of some of these materials, right? And even broader than phosphorus, being able to pull other materials or other pollutants out with a variety of materials, right? But I guess the question is, what are the key takeaways from where we are right now, where we want to be in the future in terms of achieving our TMDLs, our water quality goals, protecting our Minnesota's water resources? What should we take away from this discussion that we can do as a stormwater industry and practitioners, even tomorrow or in the next week or months, short term, to make advancements in this area? What would you recommend that we take away?
I think to echo your comments back there about you'd like to see some of these medias removed from the manual and from other specification guides. It's what can we do to, you know, my answer to that is like, well, what do we have after we remove those? You know, like we're just going to fill them with clean sand. Like, I don't know if we can do that, you know? So it's finding that appropriate alternative as fast as possible before we can yank those out, I think. And I think it also has to be ultimately cost effective. I mean, this is the reason why we haven't used a lot of other absorptive media for some of our practices. It's too cost prohibitive, or there's not a supplier nearby, what have you, you know, so.
I think for us, maybe it's more just like thinking outside the box or in a way that's different from conventional, where our system is run and permitted like a wastewater system. So it's kind of a different viewpoint as opposed to like the traditional, just like, do I get it done to stormwater standards, I guess. But trying whatever you can that works for your treatment train probably is different from normal, is my advice.
I guess I think we have a lot of tools in the toolbox is kind of a big thing right now, and just kind of knowing what we can use, continue to try some of these innovative practices, you know, to the point that we're able to, and then also really focus on getting information back from those so we can continue to expand on what we're doing. So it may be, you know, working with stuff that's already in the ground and monitoring. It may be looking at different states or different regions and finding information of what's worked for them and tweaking a little bit. But I think really we've got a lot of options, and that list of options continues to grow. So just continue to use those.
I get the last word? You do. I'm going to give you a little bit of an academic answer. And, I fully agree with the tools in the toolbox, and there's going to be continue to be more tools. There's going to be more developments with biochar, with other materials that'll be there. And, we'll have to make more choices. Our stormwater challenges are changing. We kind of think of things with, okay, if we reach this point, everything will be good, but I'm not convinced that's the case. Climate's changing. We continue to develop, things are changing. So once we fix one problem, there's going to be another one showing up. So I think more than ever, we just kind of need to be aware that and have our eyes open to new technologies and changes, because it's always going to be there.
We have a continuously moving target, right? So we need to continue to work here. Well, with that, I would like to thank the audience here for attending. I'm going to thank the panelists as well. Please help me in giving a round of applause for our panelists and speaker.